The Governor-General, Michael Jeffrey, arrived back in the country late Friday night, and this morning dozens of media representatives have gathered outside the gates to Government House waiting for the Prime Minister's car to roll up. If John Howard does seek an election on November the 24th, then he will be committed to the longest election campaign since Bob Hawke set a 43-day campaign in 1984. To get the very latest, I'm joined now by Jim Middleton, the ABC's political correspondent. Jim Middleton, good morning. What are you hearing?
Well, it's a beautiful spring morning here outside the gates of Government House, Barry, with a bit of the fluff from the trees, the birch trees drifting across our camera. What we know is that the Governor-General has left Government House this morning to go to church, which he regularly does every Sunday. The Prime Minister has just left the lodge to head for Parliament House to make final preparations before making the journey, the 5-minute journey from Parliament House to Government House, the long drive down Dunrussell Drive through the Spring Oaks to seek Michael Jeffrey's permission to dissolve Parliament and call an election probably for November the 24th.
Well, Jim, let's look at the task ahead for Labor and Kevin Rudd if there is to be a change of government. They need 14 seats to equal the coalition. That's the hung parliament. That requires a swing of 3.3%, and 16 seats to govern in their own right, and that requires a swing of 4.8%. And Jim, that won't be easy.
It is a big ask, but in 1998, remember, when Kim Beazley was the opposition leader, Labor won 19 seats and nearly snatched government from John Howard, and the Prime Minister himself won more seats than that to take government from Paul Keating in 1996. But remember also that the Labor Party has been ahead in the polls since at least this time last year, and also has had a massive lead in the polls, something like 55-45 right through that period. So it's definitely Labor's to lose.
Yes, before we go on, let's remind ourselves of the situation in the 2004 election result. On the primary vote, the coalition got 46.7% and Labor just 37.6%, and two-party preferred, that represented 52.7% of the coalition and 47.3% for Labor. Now, compare and contrast that with the situation as it now stands in the polls. The Insiders poll average, when we average out the four major polls, on the day the Prime Minister is expected to call the election, shows the magnitude of the task ahead of him. On the primary vote, the coalition trails 48 to 39, and two-party preferred, they trail 57 to 43. Jim, that's a lot of ground to make up.
It certainly is, and the coalition's problem, Barry, is that its primary vote has been stuck around 40 or below for most of the time that Kevin Rudd has been opposition leader. For the coalition to retain government, it needs to make up something like 2, 3, maybe even 4 points during the course of what probably promises to be a 6-week campaign. The Prime Minister will be hoping that the announcement of the campaign, the announcement effect, will be sufficient to attract voters' attention, to make them start to have doubts about Kevin Rudd, and that he can, during this period, consolidate the coalition's vote and win a 5th victory.
And it was always on the cards that the Prime Minister would call an election today, because with precious little work to do, calling Parliament back would have been transparently about tactics. The government was already sensing that, as you'll see on this exchange on breakfast television on Friday.
We have got some important bits of legislation to debate. Well, there's a bill to create tax deductions for carbon sinks. There's a bill to allow the ACCC to bring representative actions on behalf of small business. These are significant pieces of legislation.
All right. Oh, Tony, now you're just being naughty. You know you cleared all the significant legislation in the last sitting week, and it's about the ads, the $1 million of ads a day.
There's plenty of work to do in Parliament.
And it's true, a further delay would have allowed more of the taxpayer-funded ads to go to air, but in the meantime, ministers were being bombarded with negative talkback.
Mr Costello, you're an employee of the Australian people, correct?
Well, keep going, yes.
Now, if the people of Australia want and need to know the date of the election, why can't you give it? And please don't say you don't know.
Well, you've asked me not to say I don't know, but it's the truth. What else can I say?
Are you happy with that answer, Gwen?
No.
But at least now, Jim, the Prime Minister can go on the offensive on issues like 4.2% unemployment, like the reconciliation announcement during the week.
We will know exactly what the Prime Minister intends to be the theme for this election when he holds his news conference after he's been out here to Government House to see the Governor-General. That should be late morning at Parliament House or early this afternoon. Kevin Rudd's opening press conference will be in Brisbane shortly after that. But if I can put it this way, Barry, it's basically this election campaign, I suspect, is the two E's versus the two V's. The two E's being on John Howard's part, experience and the economy, and for Kevin Rudd, vision and vitality. The Prime Minister will push the themes that only a Conservative government, only a coalition government can guarantee the prosperity that we've seen for the last 10 or 15 years. He will point to figures like that unemployment figure of last week, which does show that the economy is still booming and ticking along very strongly. On the other hand, the opposition will point to work choices, which has been a very difficult issue for the government through the last year at least. And on the other hand, the opposition leader Kevin Rudd will suggest that this is a government that has run out of puff, and that he has the vision for the future. The Prime Minister does not, and that's partly why it was that last Thursday the Prime Minister did address that issue of Indigenous affairs to show that he too had something to say about the future.
Well, Jim, no doubt we'll talk again very shortly. Thank you for that. In the meantime, we'll keep you posted throughout the morning with live crosses to Government House in Canberra whenever necessary. And we'll take both news conferences live, John Howard's and Kevin Rudd's, when they happen. And in the meantime, our program guest this morning is the Minister for Defence, Brendan Nelson. All that coming up, but first, for the rest of this morning's news headlines, it's Good Morning, Kath McKenzie.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. The US Secretary of State has criticised what she calls too much of a concentration of power in the Kremlin, saying it may undermine Russia's commitment to democracy. Condoleezza Rice has offered American backing for the country's human rights activists to help build institutions to protect the people from arbitrary state power. And after 2 days of frosty talks with Russian officials, Condoleezza Rice met with young skaters at Moscow's Central Army Sport Club, where she enjoyed a much warmer welcome. An overcrowded train came off its tracks in southern Bangladesh, killing at least 5 passengers and injuring dozens more. The Probati Express was bound for the capital Dhaka from the port city of Chittagong when 5 of the rear cars went off the rails. And in the United States, 2 people have died and 10 have been injured after a 15-truck pile-up on California's Golden State Freeway sent flames shooting out of a tunnel and blocked a key link between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And finally in sport, England are through to the Rugby World Cup final after beating local favourites France 14-9. Johnny Wilkinson was the hero for England once again, landing 2 second-half penalties and a drop goal. England will face the winner of the South Africa-Argentina semi-final next Saturday for the title. Barry, I'll be back with more news at 11 o'clock.
Kath McKenzie, thank you. And just repeating, we have our cameras at Government House in Canberra, and if there's any activity, we'll cross live. In the meantime, to our program guest. And yesterday, the body of an Australian soldier killed in Afghanistan was returned to Australia. Trooper David Pearce, or Poppy, as he was known, was killed when his armoured vehicle hit a landmine on Monday morning. We're joined now by our program guest, the Minister for Defence, Brendan Nelson. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Barry.
Well, of course, the body was repatriated to Brisbane yesterday afternoon. What are the arrangements from here on in?
Well, obviously the coroner will determine cause of death, and then I understand that there will be a funeral held on Wednesday in Brisbane at the Catholic Cathedral, and the family obviously welcome anybody who wishes to attend that. And I understand following that, Barry, there will be a private service for the family and close friends only.
Now, given that this was the first Australian life lost by direct enemy action, we have been very fortunate up until now.
Well, people say that, Barry, and of course luck and good fortune's involved in anything, but I can assure you that our soldiers do so magnificently for a number of other reasons also, and that is that the leadership is outstanding from the very top of the Defence Force to the lowest ranked NCO. Also, the equipment is absolutely world class. The training that our men and women have undertaken equips them so well for the battlefield. But there's also something about the Australian character, Barry. Our people, our lowest ranked soldiers, see themselves not only as soldiers but as aid workers, diplomats and teachers. They respect and want to understand the cultures of the people with whom they work, as well as projecting force with a kind heart. All of that has combined to keep our casualties to a minimum, but the risks in Afghanistan, and indeed all our deployments, are considerable, but in Afghanistan they're particularly high.
Now, of course, in this case it was a roadside bomb, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that sort of eventuality.
Well, we've put $170 million so far into counter improvised explosive device, or IED, measures, and the Chief of Defence, Air Chief Marshal Houston, last year established a task force for counter IEDs. We've got a number of our people working with the Americans. We've put a lot of money and investment into technology, enhancing the equipment which was bought in the 90s, early 90s if you like, without the sort of stuff that was needed to protect our people. And this week I've approved another $73 million that will be invested over the next year in further electronic and other measures to support our troops in the field, to make sure that we do everything we can to protect them. The nature of modern warfare, if you leave aside the security and stabilisation and maritime border protection stuff we do in the region, the nature of modern warfare is that it's counter-terrorism, it's counter-insurgency. We're also rebuilding nations, and we're undertaking peacekeeping, often in the same theatre, and unfortunately these so-called asymmetric threats are very significant threats to our people, but so far, by virtue of the things that I've outlined, we've actually done better than many of our partner countries.
But this $73 million that you mentioned, though, wouldn't the Americans be doing this work in any case?
Well, we're all doing it, the Americans, the British, and we as Australians, but whilst we work in coalition and we share technology and data and all of the information we have available to us in understanding the threat posed by IEDs, it's very important that as Australians we invest in our equipment for our people. Some of the work that's been done by Australian Defence Force and our research agencies, the Defence Science Technology Organisation, for example, has been certainly shared with our allies and has been taken up by them. We're all involved in a common struggle, Barry, against predominantly global Islamic extremism and terrorism. It is a significant threat. We shouldn't allow ourselves to face the future crouched in fear, but we need to have resolve and will to see this through. And part of that will, in the military side of things, is focusing on the threat posed by IEDs. That's the kind of weaponry that increasingly these people are using.
OK, we've just heard that the Governor-General has returned to Government House, so we now await the arrival of the Prime Minister, and of course with an election now in the offing, Minister, what's your mood? What's your mindset going into this campaign? Are you apprehensive, nervous?
Well, it will be, as it will always be, about our future, Barry. It's about understanding where we've come from. Our country's very much headed in the right direction. We live in an Australia today where our kids can go from school to an apprenticeship, training, TAFE, university or employment. Reflecting the confidence Australians have in the future, our fertility rate has increased, and we also obviously are focused very much on the future, making sure that we are prosperous and secure in an economic sense. We've got to make sure that our country and our world is environmentally sustainable, and we focused also on that, of course, and to make sure that we protect our people and our interests and values throughout the world.
But you do know,
yes,
though, that it would
be a very tough campaign.
Well, it will be, because you know that it would be without precedent for a political party to win from this far behind for this long.
Well, let's just see what the election campaign holds, assuming that it is going to be announced today. It's going to really put both of our leaders and our teams under the microscope. We're really looking at Mr Rudd, who's a former diplomat and public servant, heading a front bench that comprises 70% former trade union officials. Many Australians are unnerved by the prospect of Julia Gillard being the Deputy Prime Minister. And do we really want a country governed from border to border by one party, in this case the Labor Party? Those and many other issues and the policies for the future that will be outlined during the campaign, I think will focus people, Barry. A lot of the polls have essentially said that people think Mr Rudd's doing a better job than Mr Latham, Mr Crean and Mr Beazley, but now we've got to literally put our house on this. Do we really want to place our future, that's our mortgages, our car loans, our economic security, the defence and security of our country, do we really want to place that in the hands of a government that could be led by a former diplomat and public servant who has no experience even as a minister, and heading a government comprising largely trade union officials?
But you answered your own question in a sense, because that's what the polls indicate. They don't have the same doubts about Kevin Rudd that they might have had about Kim Beazley, Mark Latham and Simon Crean.
Well, to lead the opposition, but now the polls will, obviously the polls have been conducted over a period of time, they always are, Barry, but over the next whatever period of time before the election is held, Australians will be making the real decision come polling day. Not a question of whether you think on that any particular day you'll vote for John Howard and his team, or whether you'll vote for Kevin Rudd and his union officials, but in the end it will be, who do I really want to run Australia? Do I really want an experienced, capable team that have got my kids a job and are going to help me keep my house? Or do I want a group of people who have no experience, who are going to be controlled by the trade unions, who are going to have state Labor governments in every part of the country, a federal Labor government? Let's just see how the campaign unfolds, and in particular how the policies for the future that the Prime Minister and our team have developed, how they affect the thinking of Australians.
But when you say to help me keep my house, you're seriously suggesting that if you elect Kevin Rudd, your house is at risk?
Well, let's just, Barry, under the previous government, interest rates averaged 12.75%. They've averaged just over 5.7% in the period of our government. I remember practising medicine in an area where families were losing their homes with banks foreclosing. And as a man said to me only a few days ago, he said, I've lived under 2 federal Labor governments, and under both of those governments, inflation, interest rates and unemployment went through the roof. I mean, if you just look at the background and you look at the history of what Labor governments have actually done to Australia, and in my own portfolio, for example, significantly reducing defence expenditure and our ability to do a whole range of things in Australia in terms of creating wealth, employment, housing and being able to afford your mortgage, to afford your small business overdraft, for your kids to be able to get a job. I mean, the track record over the last 11.5 years speaks for itself, vis-a-vis previous Labor governments, and that's the kind of choice people are going to have to make.
I just want to clear up one thing. If you do win, are members, including yourself, entitled to contest the leadership when the Prime Minister goes?
Well, the Prime Minister's made it very clear, Barry, and that is that the most likely person to succeed him into the leadership will be Peter Costello. And I think given that we're going to this election with the very experienced John Howard as our leader and very experienced Treasurer of Peter Costello, and the Prime Minister has said that he is likely to succeed him into that job, although it will be chosen by the parliamentary ranks of the Liberal Party.
And that's the point. You're all entitled to put your names forward, aren't you?
Well, Barry, look, we would fully expect that if the government is returned, as I believe it should be, for the reasons I've set out, then Peter Costello would succeed John Howard at some point during the next term of government. That is the most likely outcome, but I'm not going to speculate about anything beyond that, particularly when we are so close to making a decision about the nation's future.
The Prime Minister's manifesto released on Friday, one of the 5 points was a new Securing Australia agenda. What does that mean for you as Defence Minister, this new Securing Australia idea?
Well, in my own portfolio, what it means is about significant further increase in defence capability,
and
not
spending?
just high-end warfare fighting capability, but also our capacity to undertake security stabilisation, disaster relief, humanitarian assistance and counter-terrorism activities in our own region. We've already set out a minimum forward agenda for 3% real compounding increase in defence expenditure till 2016, but our government places amongst its priorities, in fact at the top of its priorities, having got the macroeconomic settings right for Australia, our government places the defence and security of our nation at the very top of the list.
Minister, on another domestic issue, what is your view of the death penalty?
Well, I personally do not support the death penalty, and whilst I realise a lot of Australians do under certain circumstances, I believe that the death penalty is not appropriate for Australia. We also lobby very hard on behalf of Australians who might be facing the death penalty in other countries. But if you're asking me and alluding to what do I think about Hambali, Muklas and Samudra and others who murdered 88 Australians in Bali, having trained with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I have absolutely no sympathy for them whatsoever. And I do not believe that Australia, any Australian government, particularly one that I'm a part of, should lobby for any leniency in relation to individuals who murder, on a mass scale in particular, innocent people.
So what do you want to see happen to the Bali bombers?
Well, I would like to see the Indonesian judicial process run its course.
You want to see them executed?
whatever the Indonesian authorities decide in relation to those individuals, then so be it from my point of view. Let's keep in mind, Barry, we are involved in fighting regionally and globally a resurgent totalitarianism, which is in the main Islamic extremism. These are people who have hijacked the name of Islam to build a violent political utopia. They murdered 88 innocent Australians and 202 people, innocent people, in October 2002. That is one of a large number of terrorist incidents that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years.
So you're arguing you can be selective about the death penalty then? You can argue for the death penalty for terrorists overseas, but have a different policy in Australia?
Well, Barry, if, God forbid, these sort of incidents occurred in Australia, we have Australian laws, we have Australian values which support those laws in relation to the death penalty, and we do not support the death penalty here. If other countries choose to have the death penalty, then the Australian government will obviously work in support of arguing for Australians who are charged with incidents that might attract the death penalty, that they, if you like, not be put to death. But we are not going to lift a finger for terrorists who are not Australians, who have been convicted under the laws of other countries. That is not appropriate. And if you're, as I say, if you're asking me what I think about the Bali bombers, I have no sympathy for them whatsoever, and the Indonesian laws should apply.
So if they're not executed, would you be disappointed? Would you be angry?
That is a judgment for the Indonesian judicial
I'm asking
system
for your own
itself
personal.
to make.
What would your own feelings be if they were not executed? Would you be disappointed?
Well, as I say, I have no sympathy for them, and I wouldn't comment any further on that, Barry.
OK, we'll leave it at that. Minister, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Barry.
I don't think the Bali bombers should be executed because, personally, I don't believe in the death penalty. But at the same time, I can understand how for grieving families, that's a pretty contentious issue right now.
I do think that the Bali bombers should be executed. It was all planned out. It was a calculated attack to kill as many people as they could at one time. And I think that they should just be removed from society altogether.
I wasn't personally offended by Robert McLennan's comments, saying that the Bali bombers' lives should be spared. But I think it was a really, really insensitive time to make those kind of comments.
It's probably just really unfortunate that it happened to be so close to the anniversary.
If we're going to try and uphold a policy that we have here of a no death penalty for Australians, and I think we should try and fight for Australians overseas as well.
No, I don't agree with it, because I think if you go to another country and you break their law, then you break their law. Their laws are there for a purpose, and you should know that.
The federal government and the opposition are being hypocritical, that they don't mind if terrorists are executed, because it's like a human right to be able to live, and I understand that they've done something really terrible.
I think if you have a policy to be against the death penalty, then you should try and uphold that and maybe at least press your point of view on a foreign country. But at the same time, if you're spending taxpayers' dollars to save a foreign terrorist's life who's killed Australian citizens, I mean, personally, I just don't think that makes too much sense.
Let's hit the back, let's go.
Yeah, but terrorists aren't normal citizens. They're, I don't know, I think they're sort of creatures.
As far as Kevin Rudd's comments goes, as to Robert McClelland's speech, I think it might have been slightly inappropriate for to give him a bit of a chastising about it if he was standing to try and uphold the policy which his government stands to have. I don't know, I just wonder, I know it was probably a little bit inappropriate with the timing, but I would just wonder personally if leading into a federal election, if federal election wasn't so close, whether Kevin Rudd might have been a little bit stronger as far as standing up for the policy of his party.
It can be disloyal for a leader to shift the blame onto a team member. Depends on the circumstances.
And more on that issue a little later on. But Misha Schubert, where of course the Prime Minister is due at Government House at any moment. We're assuming November the 24th, but it's still open to him to call an election for November the 17th.
It is still open to him, but I think realistically we're talking November 24 and a 6-week campaign. Although it's interesting that at this outset of the formal campaign, both of the leaders actually are looking tired, which is a product of the year-long campaign we've watched them run in the phony war. Now, John Howard's challenge today is to restart the debate, to bring the focus back onto him and the messages he wants the public to listen to, because they haven't been listening to him attentively for the last several months. And so a lot of the messages, even when he tries bold new initiatives, just get lost in the ether. Kevin Rudd signs up to them immediately and the political mileage moves on to something else. But it's a weird week for John Howard to be calling this election, because in the last week he's been talking about issues that are traditionally Labor's issues. He's been out in hospitals talking about health, and then he's been, on Thursday night he did the extraordinary speech about how he would put a reconciliation referendum to the people within 18 months of being re-elected. These are not issues where the coalition needs to have the conversation.
Yeah, and the conversation though, Barry, I mean, it strikes me that it's the absence of narrative that is John Howard's problem. I mean, in '98, the story about the election was GST and economic reform. In 2001, it was about national security. In 2004, it was about interest rates and economic security. And in 2007, the story is what?
Well, the story is work choices in many ways,
but that's not John Howard's story.
But it is. And the notion that the nation hasn't been listening to John Howard, that's probably partly correct. But maybe the nation's been listening to John Howard for 11 or 12 years now, and knows exactly what he stands for and exactly what he's like. And it looks from the polls as though the nation has been listening and saying, OK, well, that's it for John Howard. I think this idea that we may now start listening to John Howard in the next few weeks. That's the best thing the coalition's got going for it. But actually, I think Australia has been listening for a long time.
Can he not, though, make the narrative about economic prosperity and putting it all at risk, as Brendan Nelson says? Don't put your house on it.
What he's going to be doing.
He must do that. And from the polls this morning, the thing that you see is that the one group that is still kind of neck and neck for Labor and the coalition are the mortgagee group of 30 to 54, and they're split evenly between both sides. Everywhere else is wide, huge gaps, but down there, where people are buying their houses and bringing up kids, it's a 50-50 split.
But the fracture in the narrative too, though, I think, Barry, is this, that John Howard's story is about macro achievement, but it's Kevin Rudd who's tapped into micro grievance. And I think that is the key difference between them.
Well, let's get some background and analysis now from Paul Kelly, political commentator with The Australian. Paul, good morning. What are your thoughts as the Prime Minister is about to call an election?
Well, it's on, Barry, and I think the point to make is that there's a greater prospect of a change of government at this election than any poll since 1996, when, of course, John Howard beat Paul Keating. And we'll have one of two scenarios here. Either Kevin Rudd will bring Labor back into government, or John Howard will stage the greatest ever recovery by an incumbent Prime Minister to win. The polls are very much against John Howard, and the government will be desperately hoping, after he calls the election, that there'll be some correction in the polls. Labor and Kevin Rudd are the favourites. They still have to win 16 seats. That won't be easy, given Howard's record, his experience and his tenacity.
Well, this is 6 election campaigns now for John Howard, keeping in mind 1987, of course. What do you think his thoughts will be going into this campaign?
Well, his thoughts will be very much on how he convinces the Australian people that he is still the leader for the future, while at the same time trying to persuade them that Labor is too great a risk. And look, the great paradox of John Howard's position at the moment is that the country is in very good shape. The economy is going well, unemployment is very low. He's run a strong government in terms of the economy, national security, tremendous support to families off the budget. Yet there's this deep sense in the community that Howard's race is over, that his political career is coming to an end, and he's got to try and combat that. It won't be easy. And the other important point to make, Barry, is that Howard himself, as an incumbent Prime Minister going into this election campaign, has said that he won't serve the full term. He's foreshadowed that he will resign as Prime Minister in the coming term if he in fact wins the election. So that's a further complication for him. Tony Blair did it. Very hard for John Howard to do it.
So 6 election campaigns for John Howard. Kevin Rudd is a novice.
He is a novice, Barry. And Kevin Rudd's message in this campaign is going to be that not only is it time to make the change, but it's safe to make the change. And Rudd's great skill this year has been to find this balance, to discern this balance between, on the one hand, projecting a sense of the future, projecting himself as the leader of the future, while at the same time convincing people that he's a safe pair of hands, while at the same time essentially agreeing in so many policy areas with John Howard, thereby denying John Howard the attack on Labor, which Howard has used so effectively during 11 years as Prime Minister. So Rudd will simply continue to do in the campaign what he's done so far all year, arguing that it's time for a change, but it's safe to make that change.
Now, this symbolic gesture that Misha referred to a little earlier on reconciliation, to have a referendum recognising Indigenous Australians, why has he done that?
Well, this is all about John Howard looking relevant. I mean, this is a desperate act by John Howard to try and devise an upcoming agenda for a new term. He's had a lot of difficulty during the course of this year cutting through. He's had a lot of difficulty getting traction. And one of the paradoxes here is that while issues such as climate change have moved against him, Howard is convinced that Indigenous Affairs policy has moved with him, has moved for him. He believes that his intervention in the Northern Territory has been one of the most effective decisions he's made this year. So essentially he wants to build on that momentum, project a vision for the future by proposing this referendum. Howard is also personally convinced that he can win this referendum, that he can carry the country on this reconciliation proposal, that he can carry Conservative Australia and get a very good result at the referendum. And of course we know that referendums are notoriously hard to carry. And the interesting thing here, of course, is if Rudd wins and he puts a referendum, can he carry the country?
It's been called a deathbed conversion, certainly a conversion. We'll know whether it's a deathbed one, I guess, in 6 weeks from now, but do you think it's a bit harsh?
I think it's a halfway house conversion, Barry. John Howard has gone halfway. He's embraced symbolic reconciliation after denying this for the entire past decade. And this is a significant change of heart. It's a significant concession on Howard's part, and he wants it to be seen as a concession. He wants people to recognise that he's listening, that he's reassessing, that he's admitting mistakes he's made in the past. He wants all that to happen. On the other hand, this is not a road to Damascus. He hasn't changed his mind on the apology. He still opposes customary law. He won't have any countenance of any treaty. He still talks about One Australia as his guiding philosophy, just as he did in Future Directions in 1988. He wants reconciliation based on rights and responsibilities. So essentially, this is John Howard's vision of reconciliation. This is not the reconciliation of the early 1990s. This is reconciliation 2007. It's Howard's version.
Paul Kelly, thank you. We look forward, as always, to your contribution, but particularly over the next 6 weeks or so. Thank you very much. David Marr, do you see it as a conversion?
No, not at all. And neither does Howard. You know, on Thursday, but look, what a spellbinder Howard can still be. On Thursday night, the vibe of what he said was about a fresh start, a new look at these things, mea culpa, I get things wrong. But once again, when you look at the text of what he says, as Paul said just then, no change. This is reconciliation on his terms, and the next morning at his press conference, he made it clear. He got up and said, I haven't really changed my mind. I have not gone beyond my well-held and well-known beliefs. This is his version of reconciliation, and all he's offering, Barry, all he's offering is a bit of rhetoric at the top of the Constitution.
He's embracing symbolism for the first time.
No, but let's look at what the symbolism is. He's going to put at the top of the Constitution, 1967 got into the guts of the Constitution and made difficult changes that really counted for Aborigines. That's not what Howard's talking about. Howard's talking about putting some rhetoric at the top of the Constitution, and he tried to put something like that at the top of the Constitution in 1999. That's not new either.
But as part of an omnibus,
the most important thing about this is that it doesn't matter.
Yes, it does.
No, not the symbolism.
What symbols don't matter?
Not the proposed change. In terms of the political narrative, which I keep coming back to, this gesture does not matter.
No impact, you mean, on the election?
No, this is a Prime Minister whose constant mantra is you don't fatten the pig on market day, who comes out on the eve of an election with this gesture.
No, this is important.
I don't think it matters.
This is about...
It's like a leftover chapter of the
narrative. This is about trying to win back the primary votes of civilised Liberals who are disturbed about this issue. This is going to civilised Liberals who might vote Labor because in the end they can't stomach
But that's in the safe seats. I mean, this is circling the wagons.
But we are talking about the safe seats now, because this is the
That's right, he's not
picture
talking
of
about
the headline.
Which seats are safe?
No, but when you're looking at the headline national figures that have come out time and time again in the national polls for the last 9 months, we are starting to talk about some of the Liberals' notionally very safe seats being at risk here. And so David's right, I think this is speaking to those sorts of voters.
My point is, this is not about him winning the election.
But what's miraculous about this is...
But the problem also is for him politically that there's a lot of cynicism here, a lot of scepticism, justifiably, I think, that a lot of Indigenous people feel that he has held up these sort of promises over a long period of time and then they've failed to be delivered. And so now it's understandable that people would be, you know, sceptical about...
He did say that he's gone down a lot of dry gullies on this issue, and of course one of them was when he addressed the Aboriginal leadership back in 1997. We'll have a look at that now.
I also need to, in the name of truth and the name of a frank discussion of this issue, to repudiate the claim that my 10-point plan involves a massive handout of freehold title at taxpayer expense. That is an absolute myth. It is absolutely contrary to the fact, and I absolutely repudiate it.
I can remember talking to the PM at the end of 1997, and he said that the saddest thing about the year had been the reconciliation conference, where there had been that horrible scene of the Prime Minister speaking and some Indigenous people deliberately turning their backs on him.
I'm the first to admit that this whole area is one I have struggled with during the entire time that I have been Prime Minister. The challenge I have faced around Indigenous identity politics is in part an artefact of who I am and the time in which I grew up.
A lot of people grew up in that period that didn't share that view.
A lot of the leaders of reconciliation grew up in that period.
Malcolm Fraser and Fred Chaney have made the point that they were products of similar generations, and they've had a very different view about how you conduct a proper reckoning about what happened in our past, and you deal with it meaningfully, and you start to let people heal the wounds and you move on. But to the extent that John Howard's put this on the agenda, I do say good on him.
But keeping in mind, though, that only this year we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the 67 referendum. Had he brought it up at that point and divorced from an election campaign, it would have had some impact.
Yes, it would have. That would have been highly symbolic.
That would have been exactly
the
moment to do
other
it.
remarkable thing to say about that speech, Barry, was that a lot of it was about Howard. And as much about reconciliation, it was about him. And again, I say this is not the story the Australian people want to hear at the moment.
But and further to your point, David, just before you go on, that fundamentally you say it hasn't changed very much. Let's listen to the Prime Minister on AM on the question of when he again insists he won't be apologising.
Well, what people are saying should happen is that I, on behalf of the nation or the present generation of Australians, they're not saying we should say sorry. I mean, I am sorry for many things that happen to people. They're actually asking that we apologise. Well, there is a very big difference. If you lose your mother, I say, I'm sorry, Chris, but I don't say I apologise for the fact that you've lost your mother.
A key to the whole of John Howard's political career has been his attitude to Aboriginal affairs, and to turn back what was happening in Australia when he became leader of the opposition. Under Fraser, under Hawke, under Keating, there was a movement called reconciliation, which was to offer something more than just fixing up problems. It was to look at issues of justice, and it was to approach questions of redress.
None of which was working.
And now Howard came to office and said, I'm not going to have any of that. And a key constituency for the success of John Howard have been those Australians, on the whole, not so well off and not so well educated and not so young, who have come to believe that Aborigines were in some way being privileged by Hawke, Keating and Fraser. And Howard turned that back when he became leader of the opposition. He's always been very good on symbolic politics. Yeah. Let's not forget, he was the leader of the opposition when Parliament moved up to the hill to the new House. And Hawke wanted Parliament to begin, the first motion in the new Parliament, to be a bipartisan motion recognising the role of the Australian people as the original settlers of the country. And John Howard refused.
The point about the speech too, though, Barry, is that it's opened the door to symbolism in this respect. I mean, if that is a symbolic gesture, a referendum to recognise Indigenous people in a preamble to the Constitution, I mean, I've spoken to some Cabinet Ministers this week who've said, well, why don't we say sorry? If that symbolic gesture's okay, why don't we simply say sorry as well?
And I think there is a yearning in the Australian populace to actually put this stuff, you know, to make it right.
Yeah.
And that's why it's really important that you've actually got a political leader now having the discussion. The problem for John Howard is that because of that history, a lot of the people who want this stuff to happen so desperately don't believe that he's really going to do it.
What's Kevin Rudd going to do that's different?
Okay, let's have a listen to Kevin Rudd.
There's the
segue, Glen, and we'll hear what Kevin Rudd had to say on the issue. Here he is.
After 11 years in office, what Mr Howard does as we head into the election is a matter for Mr Howard. Our policy's been long-standing.
What Mr Howard does the matter for Mr Howard. That's a tough critique of his opponent.
Yeah.
Let me give you a contrast now. Here's Julia Gillard on the same subject.
I just feel, you know, so many great opportunities to do this have passed the Howard government by. If we remember 2000, when Australians were marching in their tens of thousands for reconciliation, here in Sydney across the bridge, I marched in Melbourne. It was a terrific opportunity to do this. That's good, Tony, you marched in Sydney, but the Prime Minister didn't. And it would have been a great opportunity to do it then.
Yeah, Kevin Rudd, that wouldn't have been so hard to say. Rather than just what John Howard says is the matter for John Howard. Look, just finally on that topic, though, and we question the motives of the Prime Minister, but one thing that we overlook is the intervention in the Northern Territory. It may be that he's been both impressed by how that is working out and inspired by it.
Yeah, and that's right. There is a lot of feedback, and his office has had right from day one a lot of feedback from people who want to see action to fix the really chronic disadvantage in these communities. He's been and visited sort of 2 months after the initial intervention was announced, and he does have a sense that this is starting to deliver results. Obviously, there's a long, long way to go if you're going to turn around some really very damaged communities and put in huge amounts of infrastructure and investment to bring those standards of education and health and living and housing up to what we see in other cities and regional towns.
Well, let's move on to the capital punishment issue now, and Robert McClelland, of course, brought it into focus and a 30-minute speech, but here's the sentence that sunk him. Mr Howard was supportive of the executions of the perpetrators of the Bali bombings, Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, while at the same time he continued to state that Australia opposed capital punishment. Now, he brought the names of the Bali bombers into the argument and implied in the process that we ought to be supporting them.
Well, his problem
saving them from execution.
His problem was timing, as you say, but I think the political significance of the event was Kevin Rudd curling into a very small ball once again. And I think in your shout, some of your guests there, the interviewees, picked that up, that, you know, it's not a good look to suddenly turn around and blame your team for something that's been your existing policy.
That's true, but it's also instructive that everyone has begun their commentary by saying, look, Robert McClelland is a really nice bloke, which essentially is code for saying he misjudged the politics of this.
But, look, I know that it's said to be completely second-rate to look at moral issues in politics these days, but capital punishment is very interesting because it is one of those issues where people have very strongly held moral views that cut across polling. Now, polling in Australia is very, very clear. On the more awful a murder or a sex crime, the more enthusiastic Australians are for capital punishment. And that's fair enough. That's what Australians believe. On the other hand, for good reason or poor, there are a lot of Australians who believe that capital punishment as such, in any circumstances, is a bad idea. And there's also another group of Australians who see 9 bloody idiots caught with heroin strapped to their bodies who are about to be shot in Indonesia, and they're Australians. Yeah. And out of all of this massive confusion, what do? There is a notion going around that's been put by the press a bit and suggested by politicians that all of the survivors of the terrible Bali killings and their relatives and families are all gung-ho for the death penalty. They're not either. No. They're divided as well.
It's a very ambiguous
and this is a debate where, in fact, Australians on a bipartisan Australian politics in a bipartisan way adopted a notion a long time ago that we weren't going to have capital punishment.
That's true. And on the substance of the issue, Robert McClelland was absolutely spot on. And the problem for him was the timing and the proximity to the Bali bombing anniversary. And Kevin Rudd's handling of it then.
But if you want a demonstration of the ambiguity that you're talking about, again, I refer to your shout, where one of the interviewees referred to terrorists as creatures.
Yes.
Well, that would apply to Nelson Mandela at some stage in his career.
Let's go back onto that question of how Kevin Rudd handled it. And he did tick off Robert McClellan and he blamed the staff, but this is how he rationalised it all.
I'm ultimately responsible for anything that the opposition does, including my team and including those that advise my team. And part of taking responsibility in that respect is to indicate to the Shadow Foreign Minister the insensitivity of those remarks at this most sensitive time.
Now that's clear, isn't it? Like the responsibility stops with him, and that's why he needs to name and shame those who screwed up.
Exactly. Who screwed up, by the way, by stating unequivocally Labor Party policy.
Well, and all Robert McClellan did essentially, people have sort of had a debate about whether he changed policy or moved. He just filled in a bit more of the detail about exactly how this regional coalition would work.
I mean, it rendered the Prime Minister defending
Robert
McClellan. That was interesting.
Is this a debate you have 6 weeks out from an election by choice?
This is a question for us. Does the sight of Rudd doing what he did horrify us on human terms or make us think that's professional?
Yes, maybe
both,
so, but if you
probably.
think the can stops there, it doesn't. The view of the government as a whole was that this couldn't have happened to a nicer bloke. And I mean that. It couldn't have happened to a nicer bloke. Here they are.
I thought it was astonishing that Mr Rudd would come in and just cut down his shadow minister, a very, very senior shadow minister, in the interests of political opportunism.
I think McClellan has been treated very badly. And he's a strong Labor man, he fights for his cause, but most people regard him as a decent bloke. He is a decent bloke, and he was arguing his brief.
Mr Robert McClellan, one of the most intelligent, capable and respected members of the Labor front bench.
What we've seen over the last 24 hours is a really shifty and weak opposition leader, and I think Robert McClellan is entitled to feel pretty badly ripped off by his leader.
Well, he's a good bloke.
Barry, I have to say, our viewers should understand, of course, when it comes to the Prime Minister and Robert McClellan, is they are both rabid St George football supporters.
Oh, so it's genuine.
That at least was genuine, yes.
But, you know, I don't think many Australians had heard the man's name until last week, and suddenly he's being commended across the political spectrum.
OK, and as a result, perhaps of this, or perhaps not, there's a gag of sorts in place. How does this gag work? Does it exist? As Kevin Rudd said to his team, that before you say anything on anything that matters, check into head office?
Yeah, ring campaign headquarters and make sure you have your facts straight was how they sort of presented it after the fact. But essentially this demonstrates how we are in lockdown mode now, and both sides of politics do this sort of stuff where they word goes out to the candidates, don't open your mouth and create some kind of a drama because you're trying to comment on national policy that you're not fully across the detail of.
So we shouldn't be troubled by this. This is discipline.
Well,
this is discipline.
I think
even
we should
when
be
it's
troubled
Labor
by
Party
this because
policy.
what it actually says about the calibre of politicians and the calibre of people that parties are running is that they don't trust them to be intelligent, rational human beings who can read their own party's policy and debate it without having their hand held.
We've seen evidence of that, David.
But, I mean, how would you feel if you're a Labor Party candidate out there in the field and you've boned up on Labor Party policy and you think you've got it straight? You think, unlike most of the people in Australia, you think you understand what the party stands for, and you stand up and you say it, and you get kicked down by the leader of your own party.
Or in the case of Miss Corns in Adelaide, you don't know Labor policy.
Oh, well,
and you get kicked down.
but that's a special case.
Or in the case of George Newhouse in Wentworth, you're not allowed to say anything at all.
Yeah, and the reason why they do this stuff is, of course, because sometimes candidates then do shift the debate. Remember, during the 2004 election campaign, was it Jan McFarlane, was that her name? The West Australian Labor MP who got on radio and was saying, oh yeah, there's $600 family payment that'll go, oh yeah, maybe we should have another think about that, she says. And so suddenly Mark Latham is there defending his policy fundamentals.
Now, the Sudanese refugee issue got another spurt along this week, largely because of a rather testy news conference that Kevin Andrews gave in Melbourne. Here's part of that.
I was making a general comment about settlement, and there was nothing new in that comment.
Well, it wasn't general, it was specific to the Sudanese community.
Well, can I answer the question?
Well, how about not saying it was general because it was specific?
Would you let me answer the question? I'm not proposing to apologise for saying what people are concerned about. That is, we've got challenges.
How did your comments help the situation?
Sir, if you want to keep interrupting, you can do the press conference, but if you'd like to get me to answer questions, can you just please wait? Now,
Now, the background of that, of course, was a detective was assaulted by, it is alleged, a young African man who had attended a funeral earlier that day. John Brumby and the police blamed alcohol and not the Sudanese in general.
Well, why does it become a race issue? I mean, if similar crimes of violence or alcohol-fuelled rage are committed by white Australians, do we suddenly say, well, hang on a minute, our society is in chaos, we now need to rethink, you know, letting young men out and roaming the streets? You know, it's just actually, you know, it's bizarre to watch Kevin Andrews try and justify this, because
but I don't think it's about race, though. I think it's
What?
just I just think it's ministerial
not?
incompetence. I think he just I just think he blundered into this.
Nevertheless, as a result, in the last week or two, the community's been talking about Sudanese refugees. They've been talking about capital punishment. They've been talking about whether or not the Prime Minister ought to apologise to the Aborigines. Yet again, that issue has arisen. Those issues might work for the government.
But this is, you know, in the same week that Howard is making these sort of shadow play about Aboriginal reconciliation, his Minister for Immigration is going on about the Sudanese. Now, this is about the seat of Isaacs, isn't it? A lot of Sudanese living in Isaacs.
I think that's a bit micro.
No, come on. This is race politics played pure.
Remember, Dave, this is race politics. Why is the quota exhausted by the Sudanese being filled with people from the Middle East and Burma?
Because,
if it's about racism.
Because we are more used to the sight of people from the Middle East and Burma in this country. And a few years ago, it was the Sudanese who were being held up. As the reason why we had to stop the boat people, because these people were in extraordinary need. Their needs are now no less.
Okay, we're shutting the door. We have to move on, and just before we do, we would like now to acknowledge the death of one of the greats of Australian politics, Kim Beazley Sr., the father of the former Leader of the Opposition.
As a youngster growing up with a dad in politics, he was at the family table. And the family table was a history tutorial, a politics tutorial, a moral ethics discussion, whatever you care to name it, it was. He was also deeply concerned too for the Aboriginal people. And he took up a whole range of causes related to the dignity and welfare of the Aboriginal people. And he had many other causes and challenges during his life.
A big slice of history there. Misha Schubert, David Marr and Glen Milne will be back in a few minutes, but time now for Mike Bowers and his regular segment, Talking Pictures.
I'm Michael Bowers and I'm pictorial editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm talking pictures this morning with Peter Nicholson, who cartoons for the Australian newspaper. Welcome to the program, Peter.
Thanks, Mike.
And it continued this week where the death penalty was kind of political suicide.
And this one was a funny story, wasn't it?
Your cartoon here, any last words before I release another policy, capital punishment, and you've got them both being shot here, Robert McClelland and the leader.
Yes, a rather angry-looking Kevin Rudd. Wondering why he's being tied up there too.
Run us through this one, Peter.
Well, this was the day after the other one, so I've got Kevin Rudd is really calling on everyone to keep their feet on the ground, especially McClelland, who is obviously getting a bit esoteric. But as you can see from the picture, he's hanging on the end of a rope, and Robert McClelland is up in the being hung from the rafters there, with his feet hanging down.
Dyson did Labor outlaws capital punishment, slow torture still acceptable, and he's got Kevin Rudd stretching the Prime Minister on the rack.
Yes, it's a very elegant drawing like Andrew Dyson's. This is a good one by Andrew Well, and he's imagining different ways in which Howard can hang on to power. The first one is the Burmese style. So he's got Howard standing here as some member of the junta, with Kevin Rudd being beaten by the cops.
I've waited so long for this moment.
And then the second one is the Russian style. So he's got Howard doing a bit of a Vladimir Putin, and he's going to linger on and become the, what do you call him there?
Primary advisor.
I will henceforth be primary minister to the Prime Minister Costello.
And the third style, American style, create a dynasty. OK, Jeanette, you're up.
Yes, and he's giving her a low five there as he's going to run with the baton.
Doing a Hillary. Yeah. Revelations that perhaps the Rudds were going to buy a waterfront property.
Yeah, this is a good cartoon by Mark Knight from the Herald Sun.
I had no intentions of buying a $5 million beach house. My wife, however, on his salary, are you joking?
All his cartoons are beautifully drawn. I think he's one of my sort of, heroes as a cartoonist, the way he gets all the details right, the faces right.
And Peter, you were tackling the political environment in your animation this week.
Yeah, we had it seemed to me a logical sort of thing with Garrett, singing. So he took one of his songs there and had him trotting along for singing lessons.
1, 2, 3, 4. Call me
working in the pulp mill.
Hold it, hey, hold it there. More feeling on the word pulp mill. I want to hear those trees falling and those votes rolling in.
Peter, how much work is involved in one of these pieces? Well, it's pretty labour intensive, but you know, I've got a sort of team of people. We have to work really, really fast. I've got Paul Jennings produces the voices.
I'll do it if you can't. I used to sing in the church choir, you know.
Mike Hill does the animation and we work together, so we're both drawing flat out and just feeding the bits into the computer. And, you know, we're using a marvellous program called Flash where you can just draw straight onto the computer and quickly turn it into animation, but it still takes a lot of drawing. And so people can see your animations on the Australian website, which is www.theaustralian.com.au. That's right. They come out every few days. Peter, it's always a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning. That's a pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me on your program.
And there's a bit of an update on the cartoons. Zanetti made a late run, I think, on Saturday with this, that he had the white man, that's John Howard, come for reconciliation. I don't want any trouble over the next few weeks. And the Aboriginal gentleman says, get on to centre bet, $20. You'll call an election this weekend. $20 well spent. Well, again, we've heard nothing from Government House in the last hour or so, but it will happen, we're told, in the next 30 minutes or so. In the meantime, let's. George Brandis was on Late Line on Friday night, and I think he gave us a pretty good sense of the main theme of the government's approach as the election begins.
I think the public know that the next few weeks there will be a real contest for this nation's soul between a government that has given them the greatest prosperity they've ever enjoyed and is a safe pair of hands, and an opposition with undercooked policies, a Me Too attitude and a weak leader.
The plan I've put before the Australian people throughout this year, dealing with an education revolution, dealing with the need to tackle climate change and water, dealing with the challenges of fixing the Federation, health and hospitals, and dealing with critical infrastructure investments like high-speed broadband, they are all there for people to see and read and make judgments on.
And of course, part of the attack against Kevin Rudd will be the union links. 70% of what's the quote? 70% of all ALP members, or front benchers, front bench are former union officials, wall-to-wall ALP governments around the country.
Are Australians terrified of union officials anymore? I thought one of the things that's happened over the, starting under Hawke
was bogeyman power has dissipated.
Taking the bone to union officials.
I think the point, though, David, is not that they're terrified of them. It's just that, given the way the workforce has developed and the economy has developed, they're becoming increasingly unrepresentative.
But I think that was a really interesting dichotomy there. I mean, that's exactly what we're going to see from the campaign themes. Stability and security being the coalition's lines, sort of freshness and fairness being Labor's lines. But another interesting point about the changes to the electoral laws that happened last year was that when the writs are issued, the polls will close at 8, electoral roll will close at 8 o'clock on the night. So if you're a young person out there and you're not on the electoral roll, I've got to declare my interest as an ambassador for the YWCA's Enrol to Vote campaign here, you need to get out there and get your form.
How much time will they have?
They'll only have till 8 o'clock on the day that the writs are actually issued.
So get out there
if John Howard issues the writs today, they'll have till 8 o'clock tonight. If he actually announces today and has a delay of a couple of days in the formalities of the paperwork going through, which he did last time to allow Parliament to finish off a little bit of business, then they'll have a couple of days. But do not tarry.
Right, okay.
Well, given the opinion polls this morning too, which show that I think it's 70% of the youth vote are going to vote for Rudd, and that's up from 63 at the last election.
And Labor will campaign on this stuff because they've been, they were really cross when the laws went through, and they've been making the point that something like 400,000 young people only got onto the electoral rolls in that little window.
We're running out of time. Final observation.
Nick Xenophon's entry to the Senate campaign in South Australia is going to change the whole tenor of that debate. I think he's got a really strong chance of picking up the quota that Natasha Stott-Despoja had in 2001.
I think you're right, David.
If we can't do better than the clips we've just seen of Brandis saying what they stand for and Rudd saying what they stand for, we are in for a terribly boring 6 weeks.
Glen?
Matt Price, despite his illness, says he'll keep filing during the campaign. I'm sure he's crazy enough to keep doing that. Keep the copy coming, Matt, and good luck.
He filed this morning. Just further on to the battalion of viewers who have been inquiring about the health of Matt Price. He has had preliminary surgery for brain tumours, and that went well, but he has got a very tough time ahead of him, no doubt about that. His Canberra colleagues put together this CD with some personal song choices, and if you did read his piece on Bob Dylan, then you would appreciate the cover. Matt asked me yesterday to thank all the well-wishers. He said he'll be back, and that, he said, is definitely not his final observation. There'll always be a spot on this couch for him. And that's it for this week. I'll be back with Offsiders at 10:30. We'll keep you abreast of all developments in Canberra. But here's Alan Kohler and Inside Business.